Hello and welcome to another AIC video. I'm going to say something pretty controversial right at the beginning of this video. It is July of 2026 and the T14 Gen 2 AMD is the best budget ThinkPad you can buy right now. There, I have said it. Don't buy a T480, don't buy a T440p, don't buy a pre T480, T470, T460. Don't buy those. They ain't worth the money. A T14 Gen 2 AMD is the best ThinkPad you can buy. Now, some people want the T480 because it's the most upgradable or whatever. Stop. That isn't worth it. You're going to overpay for way too old of technology to receive what? An additional RAM slot and not have any soldered RAM? Now, a T480 was an excellent deal when it initially came off lease, and they were smoking price. In fact, I think it was one of the most popular ThinkPads bought by by companies, and so there were a ton of them available and were really, really cheap. The problem is AMD came out with their Ryzen CPUs and have smacked Intel around pretty hard. And for the next several generations, AMD absolutely trounced Intel in performance and efficiency. And it hasn't been until the last few years with the Core Ultras that Intel has really been competitive with their CPUs. So the 8th gen Intel Core i5, i7 processors are really just two 7th gens soldered together on the same die. And you can't even get double the performance out of them because they get too hot and because of power limits. You're basically running two CPUs of the previous generation, and with CPU cooling in laptops and power delivery, it underperformed. You should have gotten twice the performance, and you just didn't. And it really was, the 8th gen was really a knee-jerk reaction to the Ryzen showing up in the marketplace. And Intel hoped to stay dominant, or at least competitive, but they were very much playing catch-up to AMD, and it really shows. At this point, with the T14 Gen 2 we're looking at here, with a Ryzen 3 architecture, got about a 30% performance increase. I've seen as much as 50% performance increase over the 11th gen Intel processors released in the same platform. Not even really a comparison, and they ran cooler with better battery life. Much more efficient systems. Also the screen. So this one here has a 300 nit screen, which is the lower quality screen. The T480s came with a 250 nit screen. Now, you could get the 4K panel, but that's extremely rare. And a lot of them even came with the 768 panels that were TN and only 220 nits. They're objectively terrible screens, especially if you have to work in any well-lit area. I'm looking at you, any normal office space or well-lit bedroom, not to mention any thought of working outside. And the T14 is slightly smaller and lighter than the T480, not enough to really make a difference, but you get nearly identical ports, and it uses the same docking port, which is a great docking port. With one kind of minor exception, we went from a 4-in-1 SD card reader to a micro SD card reader. It's not that really big of a deal for me. There's the micro SD card reader right there. Everything that I use that uses an SD does use a micro SD, so it's perfectly acceptable. You get better speakers, a lot better speakers. They're still not great, but with older ThinkPads, I swear Lenovo was punishing you if you wanted to actually use your laptop for any kind of multimedia. People don't like the keyboard as much. It has the 1.8 millimeter travel on the T14 versus the 2 millimeter travel on the T480. But I've tested hundreds upon hundreds of laptops, and especially ThinkPads. And unless I was testing them back to back, I really wouldn't notice the difference between them. On the T14 Gen 2, it's a really good keyboard. It's very competitive compared to other manufacturers of the same area, and well within the ethos of a ThinkPad having a great keyboard. The real difference for me is price. Obviously, when buying used, prices can vary wildly. In fact, I got this T14 Gen 2 AMD as a parts-only laptop for $50. $50. You heard that right. But I needed to get it a new battery, an SSD, an additional stick of RAM to bump it up to 16 gigs. But it has a great screen. It has no broken bits. The keyboard all works. And it still cost me less than what they typically go for. But on average, you should spend less than $250 on a T14 Gen 2 AMD. And if you really shop it like I did, you can really snag a great deal, especially if you're like me and you tend to have spare parts laying around. You're able to, like, the RAM didn't cost me anything because I already had 8 gigs of RAM in my stockpile. Now, the problem with the T480 is far too many people are paying over $200 for a T480. There are people who are getting deals and paying in that $50 to $75 range, which is an okay price. If that's what you're paying for it, and you're not having to throw in a bunch of money at it to replace batteries or add RAM or storage, things like that, that's not a bad price. But if you're paying $200 for an 8-year-old laptop, it's just too much money. And then I see listings that sell for over $500, which is just pure insanity. There's nothing about the T480 that makes it better than a T14 Gen 2 AMD. So I'm focusing very heavily on this specific year. Why not a Gen 3? Mainly soldered RAM with no upgradability. The Gen 2 has soldered RAM, could be available with 8 or 16 gigs with an available RAM slot. So you can have up to 40 gigs, depending on mine can have up to 40 gigs because I have the 8, I can add a 32 gig DIMM, or if it has 16, you can have up to 48 gigs of RAM on board, with 16 gigs being pretty sufficient for most people in most scenarios. But with a Gen 3, it will either have 8, 16, or 32 gigs soldered. 8's not enough. 16 would be sufficient. And 32 gigs is definitely more than sufficient for most people. But the price for those models is pretty expensive. And with a big price jump over the Gen 2s, with prices often around $500 for the 32 gigabyte models. It's not what I consider budget. If your budget's over $500, then your options are just simply broader. Why not a Gen 1, the generation before this? While there's nothing wrong with a Gen 1, it is only a Zen 2 architecture versus the Zen 3 in this, and there's a 15 to 20% performance increase over the Gen 1s versus the Gen 2s. And so you're getting a pretty decent performance boost on the Gen 2s over the Gen 1s, but the Gen 1s don't sell for much less than the Gen 2s. So you're not saving much money, and you're giving up a decent amount of performance. And so if you get a Gen 1 and it's a smoking deal, I wouldn't say no to one. Just be careful on spending, again, too much money on it. So if you're looking for a budget ThinkPad, skip the T480. It's simply too old. It's too out of date, too meme to the point of prices being stupid. So unless you're getting it for a song and are willing to put up with its much lower performance, go for the T14 Gen 2 AMD instead. I do have, and we're just finishing up the benchmarks here. A non-ThinkPad laptop with a 8th gen Core i5 processor. So this is a Ryzen 5 and this is a Core i5. And we have, get that screen. This is your 300 nit, 250 nits. It's such a big difference when, of course, this is a glossy screen, which I don't like. But if we look here, CPU performance, we have a score on the 8th gen Core i5 processor of 6956. Over here, we have a CPU mark of 15311. That is almost, what, a 90% improvement in performance. That's nearly twice as fast for a ThinkPad would be similar money. It just doesn't make sense to give up that much performance to the older system. And we have more than double the GPU performance. It just doesn't make sense to put the money into an 8th gen processor in 2026. The T14 Gen 2 AMD is the better laptop, hands down. And is it the better laptop than the Intel version? I recently did a comparison of, happens to be HP laptops, but the Intel variant of the two nearly identical machines, just difference being an Intel versus AMD, got like a 40% bump in performance over the AMD got a 40% bump in performance over the Intel. Pretty significant performance difference for the AMD in this generation of laptop. Enough that I think people would actually notice. Normally, between generations and things like that, I don't think people really notice the performance difference in things in their everyday computing. But this is fast enough that I think it matters. Anyways, if you have any thoughts, comments, questions, leave those down in the comment section down below. I will do my best to answer those and respond to those. I'm sure I will get a few comments telling me where I'm wrong. You're welcome to tell me where I'm wrong and where you think I've made a poor judgment. But to the best of my ability, I would encourage anybody who's looking for a new budget laptop in 2026 that is looking at ThinkPad. This is it. This is your model. And now, again, don't spend more than $250. I would say maybe if it's coming with like 32 gigs of RAM, or if it comes with like 1 terabyte hard drive. Obviously that does factor into your pricing because those prices right now are so crazy. But if it's just a standard Ryzen 5, either 8 or 16 gig soldered and 256 gig SSD, whatever, don't overspend. You're going to throw your money away on a system. So we're looking at budget. Don't go over your budget. Anyways, thank you for watching. I hope you have an amazing day.